My name is Richard Seroter. Welcome to this third module in a course about Platform as a Service using Cloud Foundry to build and manage applications. In this particular module, we're going to look at a few advanced scenarios around resilience and configuration that build on what we've done so far but show you some more sophisticated scenarios. So what we're going to cover is first we'll talk about environment variables. How do I store the information about my application runtime in environment variables, not have to rely on configuration values or configuration files, things like that. Instead, use environment variables. We'll talk about background applications. How do I run worker roles that don't have a public-facing route but can do some asynchronous processing of data? We'll talk about no downtime updates. So we showed in the previous modules how you can do deployments and do updates, but when you push, you do typically take your application offline. How can I handle a no downtime update scenario? And then finally, we'll play with application crash and recovery scenarios. Look at some of the built-in resiliency that Cloud Foundry offers. So far, we've been looking at this reference architecture. This is what we've built so far. You've got this up and running. You have a Ruby front end sitting in Cloud Foundry. You have a Node.js REST API sitting behind it, and that talks to a MongoDB database for persistence. What we're going to be extending in this module is this. So we're going to add a background job that runs in Node.js, and we're going to add Amazon Web Services SQS, or the Q service, instead. So what we're really building is, instead of the create API in the Node.js service, immediately adding something to Mongo, we're going to actually instead add that to a queue. The background job then pulls from the queue and works it. So this handles burst scenarios. This handles cases where I might not want to have that sort of contention where my insert API might get overloaded because I'm getting a bunch of donations coming in or something like that. I'd like to be able to throttle and do some control. So instead, I'm just dumping to a highly available queue, and the background job will process them as it can and update the database. So let's talk about environment variables. What's the role of them? Why do I use them? What can they help us with? If you remember with the 12-factor apps, storing properties in the environment is preferred instead of configuration or code. Really, the role of environment variables, though, is how the runtime communicates with the app. This is set by you. These could be set by the DEA, by build packs. It tells information about the runtime to your application. So as we mentioned, they can be set by the system or the user. So you see system provided and you see user provided. So for example, the DEA sets things like the memory limit or the port or user or certain settings like that, even the vcap_services, which tells some information about the services bound to each application. And then you can also have user ones, though, where the things that you provide, either in your manifest or at runtime, and we'll walk through examples of both of those. Likewise, build packs can actually set these. So for Node, it actually has something available to it. The build pack sets things like a cache directory and a path. So some of these environment variables are dependent on which build pack you're using and what it exposes to you. As I mentioned, you can manipulate this in the command line interface or in manifest. So I can build a manifest, and we will do this, where we add the environment variables to the manifest so that when it pushes it, those get set into the environment. Or you could say, look, I don't want to make these configuration values that are in my manifest. I'd rather have them be something that's set at deploy time or set at runtime. You can also do that by setting and unsetting them through the command line interface. Really, working with environment variables is pretty simple. Simply, it's a cfenv command, and you pass in the name of the application that you want to look at the environment variables for to at least retrieve them. Setting them is pretty straightforward. I can simply do set environment, pass in the app name, the variable name, and the variable value. So imagine setting a variable name of environment and then setting in the variable of production or test or QA. And then I can also do unset the environment variable by passing in the app and the variable name, and that will remove it from the list. If we look at what the manifest offers, there's a section that you add below applications or services or things like that, where you have env : and then put the name value pairs of the environment variables you want to insert. So again, imagine this example where I'm setting which node environment this is. Hey, it's production. or the tracing flag is off. That might dictate what things I log or not log in the environment. We can set these, as I saw, either in the manifest, shown here, or in the command line interface, which we'll do in our next exercise. So in this lab exercise, we're going to mess around with environment variables just a bit. We're going to retrieve them using the command line interface. We're going to look at them as well in the Pivotal console, and they run pivotal.io. We'll also set them using the CLI, and we'll add them to the manifest of our application so that we can start using them on our next push. So here in the environment, we're going to go ahead and make a few changes to our application. I've logged in to the space already, and you can see I ran CF apps and saw our app health. Let's go ahead and look at we're in mod 3 now, so let's jump to mod 3. And a couple things I did want to point out to start with. Let's go ahead and update. You remember we use PS web donation or web service donation 1, whatever the suffix was. And I want to make sure we make the appropriate updates in the application. So we want to look in a few different places. We want to look in the web service manifest. So first we're going to change here, make sure this is PS Donation Web Service 1, since that's what we called it. That's the first place you need to change it. We'll save that. The second place is in the Ruby application. So I'm going to go ahead, and since we didn't make any changes to that, I'm going to use the one from mod 2. If we look at our web application, and we're going to change it 2 places here. We're going to change the manifest here. It's already using PS Donation 1, great. And in case you just used a different name, that's the first place to change it. And the second place to change it is you'll want to make sure that I do use an initializer. So if you find in the config folder under initializers, I create a custom class, URL constants. And if you open this up in the text editor, you'll be able to make a change here as well. This also looks at a specific location. So here, PS Donation Web Service 1, this would be the second place to change it. This one's already up to date. So I just want to make sure I remind you of those as you're setting this up yourself. So let's talk a little bit about the environment variables. As we mentioned before, the easiest way to see these is CF and then the name of the application that you want to look at the environment variables for. So if we look at the web service, and we use web service 1, I should know better, what we'll get back is a few things here. Specifically, you'll see no user-defined ones have been set, but you'll see some system-provided ones. You'll see the Mongo Lab under vCap services. This is where the system will automatically add, for every service instance you bind to, it will add a record here as an environment variable that you can work with. And you'll see some more information about the applications available and so forth. But the one we're going to care about the most is vCap services. This is one we'll actually refer to in code, and you will see it in code already. So if we jump to the code in this application just to see how we use that environment variable, if you look at the donation web service and you look at the routes, check out donation.js, and what you'll see here is what I'm doing is I'm checking. And if this is the AWS stuff, we'll get to it in a moment. Here, you'll see that I'm looking. If the vCap services exists, if it doesn't exist, I'm just looking at the local host because I'm doing local dev. If it does exist, so this environment variable is set, I'm parsing out vCap services. You can see it's JSON. I'm yanking out the Mongo Lab entry, pulling out the credentials, and that's the URL for actually connecting to Mongo. So this is where I'm able to use the same code, whether it's locally or pushed up to Cloud Foundry, just by doing some checks for the environment variables. Likewise, you can see these variables in the Pivotal Runtime console. So if you log into your Pivotal Web Service account that we've been messing around with so far, if we look in our development space and we look at that specific application, what we'll be able to see is we'll also be able to see the environment variables in the console. So if you're working with a Cloud Foundry provider that gives you a user interface, that's great. Then you can drill in on that and see a little bit more there. Here, if we look at the web service and drill in on that, what we'll be able to do is specifically see env variables down here. And we can see vCap services here, no user-provided ones. The one really major system-provided one is listed here. So a couple ways that you can see that. If we'd like to set our own variables, we have an option here. So we can do cf set env as we talked about. And so this command, it would take in which application you want to do this with. So PS Donation Web Service 1, for instance. And let's create one called environment. And we'll set the value to prod. Great, so I could restage this if I actually want to access it. CF restage actually goes and takes your application, runs it through the build process again, stages the application, then deploys it to actually make it see all these environment variables. In our case, we don't need to be that rigorous. I can just do CF env PS Donation Web Service 1, and I should see this one pop up. You'll see user provided. Now environment equals 1. I can now access this in my code. So now I could use this environment variable that I set, called environment to determine, hey, if it's production, do this, if it's not, do that. So to unset, we simply follow those instructions and make sure that we do the opposite command here. Here we would do cf unset env ps donation web service 1, and which one we want to get rid of. Sure enough, went ahead and get rid of it. If I run one more time the ps donation command, and I want to look at that web service one more time, there's no more user defined variables. That's the one way to easily set those. The next thing we want to do is I'm going to have you jump into Amazon Web Services. So if you haven't set up an account there, very easy, it's free. Set up one at aws.amazon.com, set up an account, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a queue. This is the queue that our web service application will push messages to, and then a worker role will later pull from. So I'm going to go ahead, and I have a queue here, and I've called mine New Donation Queue. So this is where new donations go to. And so I've got a queue here. You have the URL that you'll use in code. You'll find this in your application code. If we look at the donations.js, when it actually changes the code, and we'll look at this in a few moments, but as a sneak peek, you'll notice it actually has the address here for the queue URL. And so you just want to create a new queue, name it whatever you'd like, name it the same thing or different, and you want to take note of the URL. Now I've also created a user within AWS, within Identity and Access Management, that's going to have access to this queue. So I've created an admin user. Credentials have obviously changed since I've made the course. But you end up with an access key, and you end up with a password that comes in where you get to save this. And so we're going to actually take those values. After you create the queue, go ahead and add a user, pull out the access key and the password, and we're now going to use those values when adding environment variables to our manifest. So if we look at this, donation web service, we want to open up our manifest, and now let's add the environment variables here. Here I've typed in 3 variables: the access key, the secret key, this is really the password, which is different, so don't try to use mine, and the region, US East 1, that my actual queue is in. So I'm setting these environment variables, so when I push the app shortly, it will actually use those environment variables to talk to the queue. So we could set things via the command line, which I showed you, and you can also set them here in the manifest and go ahead and save that. Now we finished this particular exercise where we retrieved using the CLI, we looked at the pivotal console, we set them using the CLI, and now we've also set them in our manifest. Now that we've talked about environment variables and we've set some, which we'll be using shortly, let's talk a little bit about background applications. What are we talking about with background applications? So why do you care about these? Why not just make everything kind of a front-facing app that talks to the back end and does as it's needed? Well, it promotes asynchronous processing. Some of the value is a background application lets you segment out some of the work that has to be done in the application instead of always relying on each of your backing services to be available or to be able to handle whatever load you're giving it. Promotes asynchronous messaging. Again, offloads work. It makes sure that your front-end application isn't responsible for maybe handling a transient failure or processing extra work. This gives you a separate scalable tier. This is where, especially in a PaaS, this gets exciting, where if there's a burst in orders and all of a sudden I'm seeing that I'm not keeping up with it with my 2 worker nodes, if I've built great stateless nodes, I can just, in Cloud Foundry, add 3, 5, 10, 100 more instances, process the work, and then scale back down again. I don't have to scale my front end just to scale my worker nodes. I'm segmenting out into microservices or different services the ability to now scale these and run these. This really helps being even more responsive. So even under heavy load, my front end application now just has to write to a queue. It doesn't have to do any heavy lifting or validation versus a worker role that could take this work, maybe do fraud checks, do a credit card ping to make sure it's valid, do all of these sort of things before committing the donation. I don't want my front end doing all of that, my user waiting for it, potential for errors. Instead, if I can just throw a temporary message out there and that scalable queue holds all the work, I can process these as I need to. So it makes the app feel more responsive.